Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemerovski, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program where we examine the reasons why our political system has become so dysfunctional and polarized. And in every show, we try and talk about solutions. How are we going to get out of this cycle of dysfunction and polarization? What are the fixes? Where are we going? And it's important to me because you can't just talk about the problem. You always have to try and put solutions in front of people. Got a really interesting show today. In fact, this is probably going to be our last hour-long show. I started an interview with Phillip Wallach from the Brookings Institution. He had written a paper that I read about and trying to figure out, is this partisan system going to kind of fall apart? Are there enough tensions in the system where there's going to be pressures on either the Democratic Party or Republican Party? Is this going to start to crater, implode on itself? And I thought it was a fascinating article. So as always, we started out to interview and have about a 20-minute interview. And that then turned into a two-part interview, and that turned into a three-part interview. So lo and behold, we ended up with almost an hour of Phillip. And it'll be an hour-long show. And it's interesting because some of it is historical perspective that I really needed. I'm not much of a historian, but I love a good history story. And he takes us back to the Whigs in the 1850s and really the last time there was a demise of a major political party. And he walks us through this and talks about the pressures. And then the question is, how does this apply to today's major parties? And what could or couldn't be a fallout from the dynamics that occurred in the 1800s and similar dynamics that are occurring today? So it's a fascinating program, and I hope you enjoy this discussion. Our next guest is Phillip Wallach. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he's in government studies. I ran across a fascinating article by Phillip last week where he takes a walk through history and looks back at the period of roughly the 1850s and the demise of the Whig Party. For those of you that don't know what the Whig Party was, we're going to learn today, and I didn't know a lot about it myself. But there's a fascinating tale because Phillip's trying to draw parallels between what our country went through, especially from a perspective of the political parties in roughly the 1850s, maybe the 1830s leading to the 1850s. And he draws some very significant parallels to today. And then he talks about how these parallels are reflected, in fact, in today's Democratic Party and Republican Party, because we know these parties are having their own struggles, and the question is, where are these struggles going to lead to? Well, in the 1850s, it led to the demise of the Whig Party. So we're going to have a three-part conversation with Phillip. The first part is we're going to start with is to get the historical perspective and obviously the lessons from history we want to talk about. We'll take a quick break for TV, although not for Facebook, and then we'll talk about the implications for today. And then finally we'll take a third break, once again not for Facebook but for TV. And then we'll come back and talk about maybe why the parallels aren't as exacting and maybe why the waters are a little muddier today than they might have been in the 1850s. So we're going to welcome Phillip Wallach and take a walk through history. Phillip, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you.
Thanks for being with us. Tell us a little bit about what you do at Brookings.
So I have a great job. I get to think about sort of things that I think are important in contemporary American politics, and oftentimes I like to look at things from sort of a political and legal angle, whereas other people are looking at more from an economics perspective. I'm a political scientist by training, and then I try to indulge my interest in history also, as I've done in this paper, trying to give a long view to some of what's happening in contemporary American politics. So I'm a generalist within sort of American politics. I mostly study domestic policy, regulatory policy, but I try to spread myself out a fair amount.
So you read a fascinating book, and why don't we plug the book and the author here? Maybe the author can make some book sales. Tell us about the book, and then we'll get started here.
So the book is really the definitive work of history on the Whig Party. It's by a historian at the University of Virginia named Michael Holt. And I believe the title is The Rise and Decline of the Whig Party, or American Whig Party, I'm not sure. It's a fascinating read. It has a lot of texture, really gave me an understanding of the 1830s to 1850s period, which was always a bit of a mystery to me before. It has a lot of detail about what went on in each of the states. And his argument is that what happened in the state parties was crucial to determining the fate of the Whig Party. And we can't just look at national politics, but it's full of all kinds of great stories. But it also just gives you a really good overview of the politics nationally during the period.
So again, our first segment today is going to be our history lesson. Let's go back in history, and you're looking at 1830s, 1850s-ish. I think right around the election of Andrew Jackson is when this gets started. So tell us who the Whigs are. Let's start there. Who were the Whigs, and why did they form a party, and what did they stand for?
So opposition to Jackson was definitely one of the major things that helped the Whigs sort of formalize into a political party. I mean, this is right when political parties are sort of getting something like their modern shape institutionally, where they're becoming voter turnout operations, where they're coordinating between local parties in all these states, which of course, back when communications were so much harder, was a much bigger organizational feat. So yeah, a lot of people saw Jackson as a tyrant, an American Napoleon, and so part of what organized the Whig parties in the 1830s is the sense that Jackson's Caesarist tendencies needed to be checked. And that he was abusing the powers of the presidency in various ways, that he was upsetting rule of law in crucial ways. So that was one of the big issues that brought Whigs together in the 1830s.
All right, so we know why they formed, and we don't have enough time in the show to really talk about the history of the Whigs. But the reality is it's very short-lived as a party, and they fall apart in the 1850s. You break it out into a few components in your article. So the first thing you talk about is the issues that had coalesced the Whigs start to dissipate. So let's walk through some of that.
Sure, and I'll just say, 20 years, it sounds short to us, but if you're living through that, I think it wouldn't have seemed like a flash in the pan, right? I mean, that they were the major presence for 2 decades in American politics. They would have felt pretty fixed to many people back then. So what were the issues that brought them together? Well, the big one was the tariff. The Whigs were the pro-tariff party at a time when the tariff was thought to be crucial to insulating American manufacturing. And they were big on promoting national involvement in infrastructure development. And they were also sort of the party of sort of fine morals, as opposed to sort of the more democratic style of the Democratic Party. There was a bit of an upper crust feel to the Whigs. So each of those things kind of fell apart over the period from the late 1840s into the 1850s. The tariff, the Democrats came to have kind of a compromise position where the tariff was set at kind of middling high rates, and there just wasn't that much disagreement between Democrats and Whigs anymore on it. Similar story for infrastructure. For a long time, Democrats had been utterly opposed to having the federal government involved in any kind of infrastructure projects, railroads, canals, bridges, whatever. But that opposition again kind of softened for Democrats, and they became willing to support railroad development, which was one of the main political issues at the time. So on these big things that had separated Democrats from Whigs, you now saw it was kind of, maybe you could find a little bit of daylight between the two parties, but mostly they sort of sounded a lot like each other on those issues.
And of course, as you point out, they didn't have Andrew Jackson or any of his followers around to hate as much anymore either, right?
Exactly.
So the things that caused them to coalesce are starting to cause them to now break apart, so to speak. So that's one element. And again, we're going to take all these elements and bring them forward to today, right?
Right.
Okay, so the second element that you find of interest is the fact that there was a growing intra-party conflict. So conflict within the party structure itself. How was that playing out?
Right, and so, there's these cross-cutting issues that don't fit into the way that political conflict had been structured. They kind of are as likely to divide Whigs from Whigs as they are to divide Whigs from Democrats. So I'll go through three of them, leaving the most important for last. So the first of them was prohibition. The temperance movement had got some start all the way back in the middle of the 19th century, and it led Whigs to be quite divided. Democrats were generally not in favor of prohibition as a policy, but Whigs kind of found themselves unsure whether they should be in favor. And Maine passed one of the first state prohibition laws that really kind of forced the issue. And so that caused one internal division among Whigs between wets and dries. The next one was immigration and the role of Catholics in American life more generally. So there was a huge wave of immigration, mostly being Irish Catholics and German Catholics in the 1840s and into the 1850s. You got to levels of immigration, and the foreign-born levels of the population in the United States as a portion of the total was something like what it is today, about 13%, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So it was perceived as a huge influx, a real disruption. There was a surge in nativist sentiment that was often tinged with anti-Catholicism. There were parties that formed up around this to some extent. There was something called the Native American Party that had some success some places. But Whigs got fairly pressured to take a stand on this. Again, especially as Democrats sort of became the party that embraced immigrants, Whigs were under a lot of pressure to structure themselves as perhaps an anti-immigrant party, but that divided the politicians within the Whig Party. So that created some problems, and a movement grew up called the Know Nothing movement, which was really a remarkable phenomenon. Hundreds of thousands of members around the country belonged to these secret lodges nested in a hierarchical structure that was all about sort of protecting America from the foreigners. And politicians would secretly take oaths and belong to the Know Nothing movement. And that became a big source of division within the Whig Party, sort of how to orient themselves to this very energetic, in many ways problematic political movement. So that's two. So then the last one is the biggest, which is slavery, and the future of slavery in the territories in the western part of the country, and sort of what was to become of slavery came to a head in the 1850s, eventually led into the Civil War, of course. Slavery had been kind of kept out of the debate between Democrats and Whigs for many years. Democrats and Whigs were both parties that had southern and northern branches, and so they sort of found ways to keep slavery out of the picture. And some of these famous compromises orchestrated by Henry Clay were a big part of that. But they stopped working in the 1850s. There was the Compromise of 1850, which was put in place by a Whig president, Millard Fillmore. And that basically seemed to align Fillmore, who was from Buffalo, New York, with Southerners. And he came to be perceived as being relatively sympathetic to to preserving the place of slavery and making sure it was not totally excluded from the territories. That left Northern Whigs feeling like they were suddenly without a political home. And so, to make a long story short, those people deserted the Whig Party en masse, first for the Free Soil Party, which had a lot of traction in the early 1850s, and then forming into the Republican Party in around 1855, 1856.
And one thing,
Republicans sort of storm onto the scene. Fillmore runs for president, having not won the Whig nomination in 1852. He then comes and sort of tries to run as the nativist candidate in 1856. So you have Republicans, then you have Fillmore and sort of what used to be the Whigs, now sort of positioning himself as a nativist party, and then the Democrats. And so you have this three-way election that Democrats win, but Republicans sort of emerge much stronger, and the Whigs are sort of consigned to the ash heap of history.
and I'm going to jump ahead a bit here because that is one of the prongs of your discussion here, the fact that we had viable third parties that were growing, that were picking apart some of the Whig base at the same time. So you kind of already answered that one. One thing you said is, I find of interest, I've been doing some reading. In those days, as you say, whether it was the Whigs or the Democrats, they had major components in the North and the South. It wasn't the North versus the South politically, right? Each party
Exactly.
had a North and a South element. Today we have, areas of the country that are distinctly blue and distinctly red. It wasn't quite like that then. It wasn't North-South per se.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there were always clear tensions between the two regions, which seemed to have different interests. I think, of course, a lot less of politics was nationalized back then, just because of transportation and communication being what they were. A whole lot more of the important part of politics happened at your state and local level. I mean, you have to also remember the country was much more agricultural back then. A small minority of the country lived in cities. Whereas today, a big part of our divide, I feel like, yes, it partially corresponds with North versus South, but it's really just as much an urban versus rural thing, or big cities versus everyone else. So I think that sort that we are living through today is fairly contemporary. It certainly was a very different constellation of interests back 150 years ago.
And then we're gonna finish this segment and move on. So you have these 5 prongs. The last one of which is essentially what you call abandonment by notables, the people that really had helped start the Whigs start walking away. Correct?
Yeah, I think the point there is just that the Whig Party kept looking like sort of this viable one of the two major parties in American political life, and its demise was really very rapid. It had high hopes for winning the presidential election of 1852, and ended up losing pretty decisively. And the party went to pieces just over the next 2 years, really. It sort of fell apart into some regional components. Some of the people who had been the most devoted members of the Whigs started dropping out, saying that the party was done for. You had, the former Whig president Fillmore sort of looking outside of the party to find political legs. So, yeah, I think the point is it can look like we have a fairly stable two-party system on the surface, but we have these tensions brewing underneath, and a whole lot can change in a hurry once something starts going really wrong for one of the two parties.
We're going to start the second part of our conversation with Phillip Wallach from the Brookings Institution. He's written a fascinating article to cause us to take a look back in history at the Whig Party and the span of their governance, the height of their powers in the 1830s to 1850s, and draw some parallels to today and question whether or not the demise of the Whig Party is a precursor perhaps for the demise of either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party today. So in the first part of our interview, we talked to Philip and we set the table for this today conversation by reviewing who were the Whigs and discussing the elements of his article where he breaks apart the demise of the Whig Party. So again, we've got the history lesson. Now we're going to jump up a couple hundred years here to today, and we're going to talk about how this could affect or how it could play out in today's world, and not just for the Republicans or not just for the Democrats, really for both of them. I think we have two parties that really are in turmoil when you look below the surface, and we're going to try and do this historical comparative. So, Philip, welcome back, even though you didn't go anywhere.
Glad to be here.
All right, so we just did a walk through history, and I think while the viewers were listening to the first part of our conversation, they couldn't help but see these parallels or see where these parallels were going. And I think in the interest of time, rather than do Republicans separately from Democrats, maybe we should just kind of lump them together a bit, because I think there's so much in common in terms of the historical analysis, right? So
yeah, sounds good.
So for instance, we started by saying, talk about the decline of issues. In other words, the issues that caused the parties to coalesce were starting to break the parties apart. And in your article, again, you walk through the Republican side of really where the world of Trump is not your grandfather's Republican Party. And then on the Democratic side, maybe the world of Bernie Sanders is not your grandfather's Democratic Party. So how do you see that playing out today?
Sure. So I guess one thing I thought it would be helpful to clarify for people, I don't mean to equate either Democrats or Republicans today with the Whigs in terms of policy. You know, it is a little tempting since there was this tariff and infrastructure, you know, we could see some of the same elements maybe in some of Trump's rhetoric. But the parallels that I'm looking at are not just about policy correspondence, but they're about these parties that we have today are facing a decline of the issues that have structured the conflict between them, and then an upsurge in new issues that sort of divide members within their parties just as much as across them. So what are some of the issues that have declined? Well, Trump is an interesting person to try to figure out exactly what he thinks on any issue, but what he says about the welfare state is especially interesting. You know, we've thought of Republicans and Paul Ryan as an emblematic figure as being strongly in favor of entitlement reform and really figuring out a way to cut down some of the welfare state programs. But Trump often speaks as if at least for a large part of the welfare state, he's promising not to take it away from people. He's not making it seem like small government in that sense is such a high priority for him, and sort of a lot of the conservative ideas around that he's made clear he can kind of take them or leave them. So there's the possibility of that declining, although there's certainly, I don't mean to suggest there's no differences between the parties, especially on Medicaid. I think you'd find some big differences still today. Taxes are another one. You know, Republicans have been the party of low taxes and Democrats the party of tax and spend historically. It's just not as stark of a difference today. Barack Obama came into office promising to be a president who never raised taxes on the middle classes. And he kept that promise. He preserved the Bush tax cuts for all but the highest earners. Meanwhile, you know, fighting against federal top marginal tax rates was a real winner of a political issue for Republicans back when Ronald Reagan came into office and the top rate was up in the 70s. But I just don't see people getting that excited about top rates at 39.6%. So I think a lot of our politics still does revolve around this fight over taxes, but I just don't see the political energy there. And I think a lot of the Republican rank and file just don't care that much about the tax issue anymore. They don't want their party to have it as its first priority, low tax rates for rich people and low inheritance taxes. I think they don't care that much about those issues anymore. And then foreign policy has become a lot more confusing also. I'm not at all a foreign policy guy, but it seems clear that, looking back at the 1980s again, when the Cold War was still on, it really structured a lot of our politics. Sort of conservative defense hawks had one position, and liberal doves had another one. And we find ourselves in a much more confusing sort of mixture of isolationist sentiment, sort of carry a big stick sentiment from Trump, worrying about the sort of overextension of American power. I find foreign policy debates today really to be fairly mystifying, and when you try to figure out what is the difference between the sort of Obama and Trump basic projections of American power, it's just a lot harder than you might think. I mean, there's clearly huge rhetorical differences and sort of positioning, how should we talk about America? But I find it a lot more confusing, sort of what do Republicans represent and what do Democrats represent in foreign policy? It's just not that clear anymore.
And of course, in your paper, I think you spent a lot of time talking about defining what used to be, the historical conservatism of the Republican Party, and again, maybe how that doesn't stand today. On the Democratic side, it was equally fascinating because you point out, it used to be the Union Party, but unions don't make up much of the population anymore. So to the extent the union influence is dissipated, where does that go?
Yeah, and Trump made in the union vote in this past election. I think, union members were still more likely to be Democrats, but that edge has really gone away largely. And unions find themselves very in tune with some of what Trump is saying on trade and his emphasis on preserving high-quality American jobs or bringing back American jobs. That sounds pretty good. So, and that lines up with sort of questions about free trade more generally. I think in the past it seemed like Republicans had become the party of free traders. And had a pretty strong ideological commitment to that. And again, today, I feel like the sort of professional ideological part of the party finds itself realizing that its sort of support among the electorate is much thinner than it would have liked to have thought before. So, you have Trump talking about trade restrictionism. You have Bernie Sanders sounding some of those same themes. You have much more of, all of a sudden, sort of an establishment sort of who thinks globalization is a clear boon for Americans versus an anti-establishment populist surge, which is much more skeptical of that and thinks that a lot of people are being left behind by globalization and by free trade.
And I think, again, that's a nice segue because the second element you talk about historically with the Whigs is the fact that there was all these intra-party squabbles developing. And I thought it was fascinating how in this election, for both parties, really, there was the establishment versus the non-establishment. And that became a bit of a theme. And I think you see that playing out and being part of this intra-party tension developing, correct?
Exactly. I mean, so it wasn't just Trump, of course. It was Trump and Carson and Cruz. Cruz, by the end of the election, under the primary election, started feeling almost establishment-y relative to Trump, which is just a sign of how far things had come, because he had really spent his whole political career, cementing his anti-establishment bona fides in the Senate. Almost all of the political energy on the Republican side was for these anti-establishment candidates. The establishment, having the establishment behind you was like the kiss of death, it seemed like. And so, but on the other hand, it's like the business community, and which is very much a part of the establishment, has been sort of a big part of what the Republican Party is about over the past few decades. And it's not quite clear just how much tension there is between business interests and the sort of uprising of populist interests, but they're not a natural fit to fit into a party together. We see the same thing on the Democratic side. Bill Clinton brought us NAFTA, working with a Republican Congress. You sort of see the neoliberal, I guess, elements within the Democratic Party, which have been ascendant in many ways. They're very much pro-free trade, pro-globalization, and now you find them on their heels. Hillary Clinton had a much harder time and had to do some policy position gymnastics to get the nomination, despite the fact that Bernie Sanders has really quite a lot working against him as a political candidate on the national scene. And you saw a lot of unexpected energy, again, sort of in these anti-establishment forces on the left. So whether that means that you can somehow see anti-establishment forces on the left and right getting together, that's not a slam dunk. There's a lot that separates those people from each other potentially. But when you look at who makes up the Democratic Party, who makes up the Republican Party, there look to be a lot of uncomfortable bedfellows today.
And of course, one of the things you discuss in your article is contentious conventions being a predictor of some of this. Now, the Republicans had a relatively contentious convention. The Democrats didn't, but part of that was because the Democrats' own structure had kind of locked in the establishment, and it locked in the fact that Hillary Clinton was going to win, the superdelegates, et cetera. You think without that, we would have had just as much contentiousness, if not more, on the Democratic side?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, they worked very, very hard to push all of their disagreements elsewhere. And so you have some unusually contentious platform fights on the Democratic side, and you had an unusually contentious fight over the chairmanship of the Democratic National Committee that just concluded a few weeks ago. So I think you did see some struggles leaking out. You saw Nancy Pelosi have a more vigorous challenge against her minority leadership in the House. So you do see the Democrats with some signs of internal strife. They just managed to sort of push all of that out of their convention this summer.
So again, our history lesson in the last segment, we talked about the pressures to the Whig Party from third parties. We're not really seeing third-party pressures right now, but we are seeing more third-party activity or simmering, I think, than we had in the past. You talk about that as well.
Yeah, so we certainly had the highest third-party vote total in this past election since Ross Perot. We had the example of Ross Perot in the 90s, which is maybe something we should think more about than we do generally. Ross Perot got 18% of the national popular vote in 1992, which is really pretty remarkable thing. And without running a very coherent campaign, got 8% in 1996. Libertarian, they put together a pretty professional ticket of two former Republican governors, Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. This cycle, that was a step forward for them. They got the most votes in the history of their party, the highest percentage, 3%, I think. But on the other hand, this seemed like their moment if they were going to make a leap to being a much more serious force in American political life. We had Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, who by the end of the campaign were both so very unpopular. And so libertarians, yes, they got 3%. That's not nothing. That could have been a difference maker, but they didn't sort of make the leap into sort of saying, hey, this is a party that's going to suddenly become one of the major forces in American politics.
And I think
you saw Evan McMullin, this guy that nobody had heard of as of, a year ago today, managed to get, what did he get? I think he got something like 800,000 votes in the end, showing that Trump himself was such a divisive figure that somebody could peel off votes even without much of a political backing or reputation. So that was indicative of something. You saw Mike Bloomberg flirting with the idea that he could sort of carve out this sort of pro-business, technocratic, centrist party. I think he would have run if he thought that Bernie Sanders was going to have knocked off Hillary Clinton. It would have been a very, very strange election if it were Sanders versus Bloomberg versus Trump. And who knows what would have come of that. But I think it would have left American politics very unsettled. That was kind of a close call that we didn't get that in some ways. And yeah, it's just, so that's what we do have in terms of third-party activity. That still is a lot less impressive than when we look at third-party activity from this period 150 years back. And we can talk about some of the reasons why it's harder to disrupt American politics today.
In fact, I do want to talk about that, but let's do that in our third segment.
Yeah.
So before we go, what you've kind of done here now is you've gone back in history and you've identified the breakup of the Whig Party, and you've associated with maybe some of the original issues that the party coalesced around had dissipated. You had intra-party squabbles as issues start to break down and new issues form. You have pressures from third parties. You have pressures from outsiders, contentious conventions. And there's a ton of parallels is the bottom line. There's a ton of parallels between that period and this period. Yet in the 1850s, the Whigs did fall apart. You're not necessarily predicting that the Democrats and Republicans will fall apart. And part of that is what we're going to talk about next, right?
Sounds good.
Perfect. All right. We're going to stick with our Facebook listeners, but I'm going to do a new introduction for TV listeners. Fair enough? Bear with me. We'll come back for the third segment. We're now going to start the third part of our segment with Phillip Wallach. He's with the Brookings Institution. He's written a fascinating article on comparing the period of the 1830s to 50s with the Whig Party and paralleling that to today's political parties. Not necessarily predicting the downfall of today's Democrats and Republicans, but trying to point out that the Whig Party did fall apart in the early 1850s, and a lot of the things that led to the downfall of the Whigs is present today, and really in both parties, Republicans and Democrats. Sometimes it may seem to some that the Republicans are a little more cohesive because they elected the president, but I'm not sure that's the case. There's always a period in time when you elect the president and the party rallies. It's not clear to me how long this particular party is going to rally, and particularly around President Trump. So we'll see how that plays out. But we've had the historic conversation, and we talked about where the parties are today. Now we're going to talk to Phillip in our final segment about maybe where history is not parallel to today, and maybe why the parties of today, if they don't break up, why they hang around a little longer. If they do break up, why they hang around a little longer. And we started talking about third-party impact, and that's where we're going to pick up with this part of the conversation, on third-party impact. So again, Phillip, welcome back, even though you're not back.
Glad to be here.
Seems like the weather's the same and everything's the same since we started talking, right?
I assume.
So we started to get on this third-party thing, and you don't know this about me, but that's all I write about these days, the fact that we need a third party to break everything up and make a difference. And that's why I thought your article was really fascinating to me, because you talk about why third parties really had a chance to make it back in 1850, and perhaps why third parties don't have a chance to make it today. So why don't you discuss that point for us?
Sure. So there's a lot of things working against them today. I mean, The most obvious, and maybe it's the most important, is that it's just the electoral institutions of our country have shifted a lot and make it really very costly for a third party to get off the ground. So back in the 1850s, we did not yet have what was known in America as the Australian ballot, the secret ballot, where everyone gets handed the same printed ballot and goes into a booth by themselves and fills it out and files it. And that's how people vote. It was not like that. Instead, you could print your own ballot and just drop it in the box. So parties could, to get off the ground, all they had to do was be able to afford the cost of printing ballots and distributing them to people who were sympathetic. And all of a sudden, they could become competitive. So that meant the costs were really very low. You could break into local elections. You could steal some seats in Congress sometimes, and that really allowed third parties to get some momentum. So today you have very high petition requirements to get a party on the official ballot. So third parties need to spend a whole lot of money sort of on the manpower needed to gather those petition signatures. The Libertarians have managed to do that, so it's such that they can get their presidential candidates on the ballot, but they have a hard time getting their candidates on lower races around the country. They're just not contesting most races. They have a hard time breaking in. And so we have, it's kind of a self-perpetuating thing because everyone knows how hard it is for third parties to break in. And there's a sense that any serious person in American politics just needs to pick a side, Republicans or Democrats. And if you're not willing to do that, then you must be somehow a little bit unserious. And so I think that's a very hard perception to shake. And you sort of need a compelling storyline for why people should abandon that way of thinking that third parties have had a hard time doing in recent years. Really, Ross Perot and the Reform Party in the early 1990s looked like the most successful disruptive force. Libertarians have really not managed to organize a nationally functioning mass membership party. If Bloomberg had run, it's not really clear that he would have had such a party ready to organize, although maybe he would have had a lot of people with a lot of money interested in helping him at least. So it's really just hard for a third party to break into our electoral system because of the rules we have in place.
Yeah, I agree with you that it is harder. But one of the interesting parallels from the 1800s to me is I don't happen to think that the Libertarians or Greens can get to the place they have to get to cause this revolution. I think it's a new party that has to form. And one of the things, if I read your article correctly, is that when the Whigs fall apart, they then splinter, and essentially parts of that splintering is what ends up forming the Republican Party. So the question is, do you see a possibility of either Republicans or Democrats splintering? So the Democrats, the progressives, break off from the establishment wing, so to speak, or maybe on the Republicans, the establishment wing breaks off from the Trump wing. I see that as a more likely scenario, that a new party doesn't start as much as one of the parties breaks apart and then you get two resulting parties.
Yeah, no, I definitely was motivated to write the article by the sense that the Republican Party could split apart. And I, since before the election, was telling everyone I thought the Republican Party would be in a lot more trouble as a party if Trump won than if he had lost. If he had lost, Hillary Clinton would be the president today, and Republicans would be united by their opposition to, the continuing Democratic tyranny, inherited by Hillary Clinton from Barack Obama. That would help to bring them together. Whereas Trump clearly has the potential, at least, to be a very divisive figure within the party. It's not clear sort of where he comes down on this populist versus business divide. It's just easy to imagine people within the Republican Party coming to blows with each other over a number of things. That said, it really was slavery as this overarching issue that couldn't be avoided anymore, that helped do in the Whigs, and that clearly divided their northern and southern halves from each other. And there's not quite an analog in today's politics that would help give that real signal of clarity that we just can't be in the same party anymore. Maybe immigration and how to think about recent immigrants would have the most sort of explosive potential. We'll see how the Trump administration and existing Republicans try to manage those tensions. Do we want to be putting a lot of American small business owners in jail because they've hired undocumented workers? Like that's what a serious anti-illegal immigration policy really consists of. And I think some of Trump's base knows that, and we have to see if he's willing to give that to them, what the business community and sort of Main Street America would make of it. I think that has some potential. And I think within the Democrat coalition, I think immigration can be quite a divisive thing also. And maybe African Americans are not so naturally inclined to favor immigration because it brings in a lot of job competition for them. That sort of divides them from many of their party elites. So if I had to pick one issue today that could sort of cleave the two parties apart such that they would need to reconfigure and sort of scramble, and we would have this confusing period with more than two parties maybe, I guess it would be immigration, but I guess I'm not certain that it does quite pack the punch that slavery did.
But I agree with everything you said, and I don't always look at it per se as needing an issue to cause that. One of the things I see happening is the polarization just keeps pushing the sides further and further and further apart, and at some point you will have a vacuum in the middle. I don't know how that vacuum gets filled, but I think it has to get filled at some point.
Well, that's interesting. So I think that one can cut both ways. I mean, it seems to me that one of the best things the two parties have going for them today in sort of preserving the existing duopoly is just how passionately Republicans tend to hate Democrats and how passionately Democrats tend to hate Republicans. We are kind of at unprecedented levels of that cross-party hatred historically. So I see that as one of the things that holds the parties together today. Now, you're right, that leaves maybe some people who find themselves pulled in both directions, who find the tension very uncomfortable, who find themselves feeling like they're unrepresented. But I guess I'm inclined to think that just sort of centrism itself is not likely to be the force that brings out a third party, just because I do think the center has mostly been hollowing out. People don't see themselves in the center. They do, on a very visceral level, associate themselves with one party or the other more and more. So I guess it's hard for me to see that as being the thing that does it.
Here's the scary scenario I'm going to give you, and then we're going to change topic briefly. Here's the scary scenario. It's not, as you said, issue-driven per se. It's that, we've now got over $20 trillion worth of debt. There's nothing in sight that suggests that that's going to be fixed. And depending upon who you talk to, we still have a lot of tensions within the economic system. So it could be a year from now or 5 years from now or 6 years from now, we could have another great recession again, triggered for different reasons. And I think if something like that hits, there's going to be a group of people who have now said, the Republicans and Democrats have been screwing around with this for 20 or 25 years now, and they just can't solve this anymore, and someone has to come together to solve it. So I'm not asking you to answer that one. I'm just saying a causation of that type could trigger something like that.
So I do, yeah. I mean, if interest rates go way up, such that the burden of servicing our debt becomes much greater than it is today, I do think that will be an impetus for some things to come to a head. I think you're right about that.
And as much as I want a third party, that's not how I want to get one, okay? And the other thing you talk about...
I mean, a lot of this stuff brings to mind the Chinese curse, right? I mean, may you live in interesting times. I do think sort of the most likely scenarios for having a major reshuffling would go along with quite a lot of social strife in one form or another.
And lastly, when you talk about the Republican Party in your article, you suggest that could remain cohesive because they are so strong at the state level, basically, right now. And my viewers know, because I've done this on many shows, right now we have a majority of the country lives in states that are not only Republican states because we call them red states, they have entirely Republican legislatures and Republican governors. And your theory is this ends up holding the party together because it's at the federalist level, it's so strong.
Yeah, I think they have done a much better job sort of creating an institutional structure worth hanging on to. And so there's sort of a lot of people at the local and state levels who would be very reluctant to jump ship because the party has so many resources to offer them if they manage to stay in the party and manage their tensions within the party rather than going overboard. You know, you have to think of it in terms of the incentives of individual ambitious politicians who try to think to themselves, can I find a way to have a greater impact and to get myself further going within the Republican Party or going outside of it and trying to do something else. And I think the overwhelming majority of serious people still make that decision. I have to pick Democrat or Republican to have a really serious impact. We've seen some millionaires spend a whole lot of money trying to mount independent campaigns for Senate or something, and they almost never get any traction. So there's a lot of very discouraging examples for people who would have the temerity to try to go outside the two-party system.
So I know you're a scholar. I'm going to give you something to look ahead for, and then maybe we'll talk in about 4 years, and we'll see if I was right or not, and we'll see how it fits into your theories here. A lot of the Republican trifectas and that strength right now is a residual of the first Obama midterm when Republicans won everything and then they controlled redistricting. There's a chance that you could reverse that this time and that the Trump midterm could produce a major backlash that could disrupt the paradigm on the Republican side, and in less states they will have control of redistricting. So that's where I see a possible Republican problem, because they will lose their lock that they had from redistricting coming off the Obama midterms. On the Democratic side, where I see the tension, this goes back to my friend Bill Fry and your partner at Brookings, Bill Fry. At some point in the world of redistricting, I see some massive tensions developing in the Democratic Party in the cities where the Hispanic population now wants a seat at the table, and the Democratic Party has given the blacks a lot of seats to hold their party together. When the Hispanics want to start to get their seats at the table, I don't know how the Democratic Party finds enough seats to give everybody. So I see the redistricting process as 2022 is a very fascinating period of time that could play out through all that. Whether or not that happened to the Whigs, I don't think so, but I still think redistricting, there's undercurrents of redistricting play out throughout this whole process.
Yeah, I think you have to, for Democrats, you have to figure out some way for the party to become not just an urban party. I think that's their big challenge going forward, because the way our American political institutions are set up, that's really not a winning strategy to be just an urban party, even if you have most of the people in the country living in urban areas. You still sort of end up fighting from a disadvantaged spot. I think it's much harder to stay popular while you're holding the White House. There's no question about that. So Trump certainly could alienate a lot of voters who decided he was worth taking a risk on in 2016, but may decide that he's turned the Republican Party into something they cannot stomach. Remains to be seen. I certainly don't think he's done that yet.
And I've predicted on this show that if Trump does not get enough things together quickly enough, all of the Republicans in Congress that have to run in 2018, a lot of them may try to start running away from Trump. In fact, on the repeal of Obamacare, you're seeing a little bit of that starting to happen now. Not a lot, but a little. And my prediction is if the congressional Republicans start to run away from Trump soon or en masse, that Trump will respond by trying to elect a whole wing of Trump Republicans in 2018. So I could see that fight playing out in 2018.
Yeah, so that would be a really important shift. You know, you really didn't see many people positioning themselves as Trump brand Republicans down ballot in 2016. If you were to start seeing primary fights between sort of Trump people versus old line Republicans, that would be a very significant development that we should look out for in 2018. So the Virginia, I believe Virginia governor's race is one to watch for that.
And so what do you say about the Chinese? We should live in interesting times, right?
Yes.
Well, I think your article points out that they lived in interesting times in the 1850s, and that caused a lot of change. I hope we don't have a civil war again. But
yeah, let's hope they're not that interesting this time.
Hopefully not that interesting. Philip, you've been a great guest. And for Facebook purposes, I think we could keep going. But I also have to turn this into a television show at some point, and I have my limits. So real quickly, tell my viewers where they can find your work at Brookings and make a plug for what it is that you do.
Sure. You can just search for me on the brookings.edu website, or I tweet at Phillip Wallach, Philip with one L. I'm on Twitter a decent amount. Yeah, it's been a pleasure being on the show with you.
Thank you. Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed today's show. Our goal is always to educate and to entertain. As I said before the show started, I started out to do maybe 20 minutes with Philip, and we ended up with almost an hour. I particularly found the history of the Whigs and the demise of the Whig Party very fascinating. And then when you grab onto that history lesson and fast forward today, it just makes for really interesting conversations and a lot of speculation on where this system is going. I happen to think that both major parties are ripe for major disruption over the next 5, 6, 8, 10 years. Maybe not immediately, but certainly over the next 5, 6, 8, 10 years. And I don't know who might get hit with this disruption first. Kind of depends upon the political cause or political crisis of the day. Certainly, from time to time, you would grab the Democrats coming off the fact that Trump won the election, and then maybe you'd grab the Republicans coming off some of the problems and slow start the Trump administration's gotten off to here. Regardless, I think Philip gave us great historical context and a lot to think about moving forward. So again, I hope you enjoyed the show, hope you were educated, and hope you had a lot of fun. Remember, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem.